Welcome. I'm Giles Whittell. I'm another editor at Tortoise. I hope you've had a very good lunch or breakfast if you're on the East Coast of the US, as I know at least one of us is. Let me dive right in because we have 45 minutes. That everything you've eaten had a supply chain and probably packaging. Every good and service that you buy or sell depends on businesses that depend ultimately, mainly still on fossil fuels. We are carbon-based life forms swimming around in what is still largely a carbon-based economy. I'm always really struck in all the work that we've done at Tortoise on climate, on a particular wedge of a particular graphic in the BP Annual Energy Outlook, which shows renewables as a share of global primary energy consumption. That share is rising sort of faster than most sources of energy, but it's still barely 1/30th of the total. And I'm hoping that one of the things that we can get to in the next 45 minutes from a business perspective is, does it really have to be that way? This is the session in which I hope we can tackle climate head on. We can talk specifically about plastics and about fossil fuels, which are in the sort of framing question. But I've chatted in advance with some of our guest speakers, and we kind of realized that these are proxies for business as usual, in a sense. So when we're asking, can companies cut the cord with plastics and fossil fuels, it is another way of asking, can they cut the cord with business as usual? Very briefly, those of you who might have joined not having been in the morning sessions, the point of these think-ins is that everybody pitches in, and that is one of my main jobs, is to invite people who make interesting points in the chat to do so. But we've got some great guests, and I want to go first to Josh Silverman, who's been good enough to join us early in your time zone. Josh is CEO of Aichi, the global marketplace for, and I need to get this right, unique and creative goods, an S&P 500 business. I want to hit you with a two-parter, if I may, to start with. I know that Aichi, on your watch, has done some pretty pioneering things in the climate space, and I'd invite you just to kind of tell us what they are and how they impact your bottom line. But also, part two, if you can take a step back and give us your view of the global economy in 2021, because all the indicators are that all natural optimism aside, we're not heading to a happy place. And I'd just be interested to have your take on that. But first of all, tell us what Aichi's been up to in the climate space.
Yeah, thanks for the question and thanks for inviting me. It's a really important topic. I appreciate it. So for those who don't know, Aichi is a marketplace. There's about 3 million people who make things, and they sell to about 65 million people who buy things all around the world. So when you're buying on Aichi, you're buying from the actual person who made the product that you're buying. And we've had a commitment to sustainability for a very long time, since the company was founded about 15 years ago. And we set a goal to be entirely carbon neutral by 2020. And we actually achieved that goal in 2019. In particular, we started with a real focus on our own offices. And we said, how can we make our offices entirely powered by renewable energy and also diverting everything we can away from the landfill. And we achieved that in 2018. Our diversion away from landfill is about 96%, and all of our offices are powered entirely by renewable energy. We then signed power purchase agreements. We were the smallest company ever to sign power purchase agreements to build solar fields to power all of our servers. And then we did a partnership with Google where we made sure that all of our servers hosted in the Google Cloud were powered by renewable energy. So everything that we could that was within our direct control, we made powered by renewable energy by 2018. But the truth of the matter is that most of the carbon footprint for Aichi is actually outside of our direct control, and that's the shipment of a package between a seller and a buyer. And Etsy doesn't have warehouses or fulfillment centers. So a seller ships her package from her house to a buyer's house, and that's not something that we're directly involved in. So what we did there was we did carbon offsets, where there's 3 projects in particular. We're funding the conservation of 10 million trees in a large forest in Minnesota. We are funding the development of wind and solar projects in India, and we're funding the alternative to some magnesium products that are particularly toxic to the environment in the automobile supply chain. And those 3 projects collectively take over 200,000 tons of carbon out of the air and offset the carbon from shipping at Etsy. And we don't think that offsets are the end-all be-all solution to everything, but we think they're helpful and they're better than nothing. They're certainly better than throwing our hands up and saying that there's nothing more that we can do. So those are the actions that we have taken. We're continuing to look at how we can do more to make sure that Etsy's footprint is at minimum neutral to the world, and maybe we can even do better than that over time.
Great. Now, the second half of the question was about the global economy and your take on it. But before we get to that, I want to pick you up just on the offsetting, because you'll know better than most that there's a deal of skepticism about how you certify offsets and when they're really working and when they're not. Are yours externally certified? And in particular, how on earth, in the third case there, related to batteries, magnesium, how on earth can you quantify the amount of carbon that you're taking out of the atmosphere?
Yeah, so great questions. And yes, they are certified. We have a great partner named 3 Degrees that we work with, and we've been really happy with 3 Degrees. We sat down with 3 Degrees. First, we did a full audit. We hired an outside firm, in this case Accenture, to come in and audit what our carbon is. So how much carbon is released into the atmosphere from shipping. Then we went to 3 Degrees and we said, here's our carbon offset needs. Help us to find projects that offset the carbon, do it in an affordable way, and that you can truly vet and verify. And they have been a great partner for us, and they do a lot of work to make sure that those projects are actually delivering what they say. Also, that there's a clean chain of title, meaning that they haven't been sold to 2 separate people funding the same project. So I think finding a reliable third party is very important, and was certainly very important to me and to all of us at Etsy. On the question around the magnesium offsets, magnesium actually has a very, very toxic impact on the environment, and it's very commonly used in the supply chain in auto parts. And because we were trying to make our offsets directly related to our carbon, it's about transportation and logistics that we're having a negative impact through shipping. So we wanted to fund a project directly in that field. So there's actually substitutes to magnesium, synthetic substitutes to magnesium, that are not toxic to the environment. They're just more expensive. And so we could subsidize the development and the use of those alternatives and make that affordable for people in the logistics supply chain. And that's what we've done. Okay.
Thank you very much for that. There's an interesting question from Harrison Brewer in the chat saying, does Etsy involve itself with implementing sustainable practices amongst its sellers? Can you address that quickly before we go on to the macroeconomic question?
Yes, so we certainly encourage it with our sellers, but in this case, we have funded it. So we don't even ask our sellers to chip in, if you will. It turns out to not be very expensive. It's less than a penny a package for the offsets. And so we said, look, we'll just eat that ourselves. And the great news is that when we tell buyers that we're offsetting the carbon, the conversion rate and checkout goes up. It doesn't go up a ton, it goes up a little bit, but it only takes a little bit to fund the whole program. So we've been able to do it ourselves. But our sellers very often use recycled packaging materials. Most of the time they do. And often they use recycled materials in the making of the product themselves. And I know our sellers care a lot about sustainability.
Okay. So just to be clear, that takes account of the emissions involved in the shipping of the product, but not necessarily in the global emissions of the activity of the seller.
So the seller's packaging is still something that that we need to look at. Sellers do usually use recycled packaging, but not 100% of the time. And it's hard for us to audit that, but I know it's something our sellers care a lot about. We do a lot to encourage that. I'll also say that we do have leverage in the broader logistics industry. You know, we are a major user of shipping services. And so in our negotiations with people like the US Postal Service and Royal Mail, we very much emphasize how important we think it is that they get to carbon neutral and that they be using renewable energy. And we push hard for that. You know, when we moved our servers to the cloud, we had, you know, Microsoft and Google and Amazon competing vigorously. And we made a point of the fact that that powering our servers with renewable energy was very important to us. And that was a big factor in us choosing Google, who has also made that commitment to use renewable energy. So using our power through our supply chain, we also think is really important.
Great, thank you. I keep postponing the other part of the question. I want to come in a second to Claire Perry and then to Alexander Stafford, but give me your take on the global economy in 2021. Are there any grounds for optimism or are we headed for a surefire recession?
There's always grounds for optimism. I think that if you look at the stock markets, they're very optimistic. So I'm a fan of hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And I look at unemployment rates around the world that are at, you know, record highs. And there's been a lot of stimulus that's been put in by many governments around the world, and that's been extremely helpful in propping up consumers and small businesses. But the impact on consumers and small businesses has been devastating. And it doesn't appear to me that that has really shown up in terms of consumer spending. And so I think caution is the right stance towards 2021. I'm concerned about small business people. I'm concerned about all of the unemployed. And I think that governments need to continue to be taking action right now to support those who are most vulnerable in all of the economies around the world. I think it's critical.
Thanks very much. Let me turn to Claire Perry, a former UK government minister, now Director for Energy and Climate at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Claire, we've had a snapshot of what one sizable company with fingers in pies all over the world has been able to do in the climate space. You're talking regularly to a very wide range of businesses. What are they being able to do right now to prioritize climate when bottom line is such an urgent question? And what is your view looking forward to 2021?
Thanks, Charles, and great to participate in this. Thanks so much for focusing on it. And Josh, I'm a massive fan. I need to do all my Christmas shopping on Etsy, I just realized, and get on with it. So I've gone from looking at this from the inside of government, and I know we'll hear from Alex, who is now taking on that mantle of what Parliament can do, to now working with the top 200 most sustainable, most ambitious companies in the world. And WBCSD, for those that don't know, it was set up after the Rio Earth Summit to be the place that the private sector brought its ambition and its action alongside the COP process, which I led for a while. And I guess a couple of things. So your question about what does the economic impact look like, Giles, is a good one. And the answer is it's incredibly mixed. So some sectors are totally, despairing and are cash flow negative and are considering very substantial layoffs and very substantial restructurings despite short-term government support. Others are doing quite well. So we've seen a big increase in online retail. We've seen consumer goods doing well. We've seen tech and comms continuing to be healthy in many cases. And of course, healthcare now is being propped up by an enormous amount of direct government investment. But I think the thing that's been interesting for me in the WBCSD platform is the question of priority. So, at the beginning of the year, before I joined, I think there was a real question mark about how many people would leave, how many would just say, this is too complicated, we can't deal, we need to put sustainability to the back burner. And the answer is we've had many more join actually over the course of the year. So companies who are can think about this, I think are taking this opportunity to very radically rethink their business models, their supply chains, and also their level of ambition. A lot of it is actually driven by what I think is a genuine shift to thinking very hard about what sustainable capitalism looks like. What does stakeholder capitalism look like rather than just shareholder capitalism? Some of it is that the markets are sending stronger signals now. So if you track, as you're doing your responsibility index, you will see that companies who are considered to have performed better on ESG metrics are outperforming markets and also outperforming peer groups, and long may that continue. Although there is a question actually about what are those ESG metrics and how much of them need to be agreed on. We have a plethora of ideas. And I think there is also a sense of, you know, COVID isn't a black swan. COVID is entirely predictable. The UK government and the World Health Organization has been talking about the impact of pandemics now for years, and yet it has caught us sort of massively on the hop. And climate chaos is not a black swan. You know, we talk about following the science when it comes to the rows over lockdown in the UK. The scientists have been saying with increasing authority and better data now, we are going to be facing a world the like of which humanity in its settled agrarian state has not experienced. And yet somehow we can't deal with that. And so the impact of that on companies, on supply chains, on the built environment, on health is going to be massive. And so we have to, I think there is a realization now, we have to stop treating this as something that will suddenly descend and we have no plans, and start actually doggedly planning for what the impact of that will be.
We have a chance in a second to ask Alexander what, in the UK case, a government with limited resources can do to help business. But what does business want from government at a time like this in terms of leadership? You were saying when we were speaking earlier that you regard the COP process, which you were closely involved with, as, I forget the exact phrase, dead in the water on its last legs, perhaps it'll be revived.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. If that wouldn't be accurate. I think the COP process has, in its pure form, got itself into quite a dangerous zero-sum game. You know, the Paris Agreement was the high point of global diplomacy, the world coming together to agree that we needed to deal with climate change and that there were some guide rails for what the outcome looked like. Having sat through the Madrid COP last year, and which really was a very difficult process and didn't achieve much, the reason I was so keen to bring the COP to the UK was I thought we had a real shot at reinvigorating this incredibly important diplomatic process. But just to say, Giles, the COP is about governments negotiating amongst themselves about non-binding pledges. The action where people are actually delivering the decarbonisation is happening through a combination of public and private activities. You know, the incredible growth we've seen in offshore wind is a public-private success in the UK. And, you know, nobody legislated for the energy transitions that we've seen. No global government got together and set the landing zone for the transition from wood to coal or coal to oil. And I think at our peril, we look to the intergovernmental process to provide real solutions. It provides direction, it provides subsidy in some cases, but we have to start looking at what we, and I use it both in the personal and the corporate sector, can actually do, and stop waiting for these, you know, tablets to come down from on high to give us guidance. And just to put that in context, since the first Rio Earth Summit in 1992 that set up the COP process, emissions are up by over 50%. You know, we've spent a lot of time talking and not nearly enough time agreeing and doing, and we are out of time.
Mm. One of my jobs is to ask the obvious/dim questions. I'm going to go ahead and ask one. Can you just define, for those of us who are not economists, the difference between shareholder and stakeholder capitalism, and whether stakeholder capitalism involves a willingness to take a hit to the bottom line for the sake of the longer term?
Thank you for asking me to define these things. So I mean, so stakeholder capitalism is, and I think Aichi exemplifies this, it is a profit-based system that focuses on creating value for everyone involved, employees, suppliers, customers, as well as shareholders. And yes, in some cases, the transition to doing that, I mean, and there are examples. If you talk to Walmart, for example, They took a very substantial decision after a hurricane hit in the US to dramatically increase the starting salary of their staff and to invest heavily in recycling. And yes, all of those things had a short-term impact. But Josh described this really well. It involves thinking not just about your own environment, but about your value chain. You know, how do you measure the emissions of your suppliers? How do you measure the way that you deliver to customers? And I think I've seen on the chat a brilliant idea, which is we don't have agreed measurement metrics yet, and we don't have agreed labeling metrics. And one of the things I'd love to see is some agreement on that, and also some transparency on the platform. So when I'm doing my Christmas shopping on Etsy, I can actually be looking at the carbon footprint of comparable products and trying to make some good decisions. Some of that requires regulation. A lot of it just requires agreement and standardization. And there is nothing stopping us doing that other than collating and improving the data, which is part of my day job.
Well, let's hope we can get there. It's clearly vital. Let me turn now to Alexander Stafford, MP for Rother Valley, one of the relatively new intake. Your CV, which I'm not going to read out, but it is completely fascinating. You've worked previously for the WWF and for Shell. You're big on hydrogen. I'm sorry that you weren't more vocal in the thinking that we recently had on whether hydrogen is the future, and you're now a member of the Bayes Select Committee. And busy on the government's green recovery plan. How much money has been earmarked for that plan, and how is the private sector involved?
Well, thanks very much for having me. And the first answer to your question, which isn't an answer, is not enough. I think things have changed rapidly, obviously, due to COVID. I mean, if we're having this conversation in January, February, I would generally think Claire might slightly disagree that this government was very keen on putting as much investment as possible into the measures. However, the last 6 months have been torrid. I mean, the earlier question about where the economy is going, I am less optimistic than Josh. We are going for a humongous recession across the world, especially across the UK and Europe, the likes we haven't seen for generations. So in short, there is no money. However, on the flip side of that, I think there's a great opportunity to still drive this message forward about environmentalism. And I think the things we have seen throughout COVID has really focused a lot of people's minds on the environment. I mean, the home working, for one example, we've seen huge amounts of people home working. I think we've moved the technology for home working, and it also, more importantly, public perceptions and business perceptions of home working for about 10 years. And I think that's a great thing. And we've seen that there's a report out today about the massive decrease in the UK from our carbon emissions from transports because there's fewer cars on the road. So already this pandemic is changing the way we live our lives, and in some ways making us live greener lives. And that obviously is great. It's changed business attitude to work from home. I mean, when I went to work at Shell, had I said to them, you know, last year, can I work from home all this time? Answer would be no. Now it's almost the normal about working from home and things like that. And that I think is good for the environment as well. On the flip side of that, I think we've seen a lot more people working from home and therefore buying their goods from home, online shops like Etsy, but across the whole spectrum. And suddenly we're getting so many more things delivered to our homes, which first of all increases the carbon emissions from the transport to get the deliveries. Outside my house, there's every day there's 4 or 5 vans dropping off items to homes next to me, but also huge amounts of packaging. Because of the way it's been transported, generally there has been more packaging, often plastic, which therefore makes to protect the goods, and therefore we're using a lot more waste. And that is obviously a bad thing. Now, I just want to briefly talk about the plastic side of things, because we often in this discussion say plastic is bad, we need to eliminate plastic. I'm going to say no, plastic isn't bad. Plastic is actually a vital tool we have in dealing with climate change. Because what are the alternatives to packaging things in plastic? Often it's wood, often it's metal, often it's glass. And those things, when it comes to carbon emissions, are far more intensive, especially when you're transporting. And obviously the weight of these packaging actually means you need more energy from the transport, which means higher carbon emissions. To me, I'd say plastic, if we have a plastic waste problem, and it's how we deal with the waste, rather than talking about plastic as necessarily a climate problem. So I think we have to be very careful about when we talk about plastic and carbon in the same thing. They are, in my view, two different problems which you have to deal with in slightly different ways. Now, going a bit more into what the government could be doing, and I mentioned all these home deliveries and things. Well, first of all, we need to massively decarbonize the transport sector. You already mentioned my belief in hydrogen, especially when it comes to transport. Vans you can electrify, but the heavier vans, the HGVs, which are necessary for this sort of more mobile working now, you can't electrify. Well, you won't be able to electrify anytime soon. So we need the government to invest heavily in alternative ways of looking at this, whether it's biofuels potentially, or, as I would agree, more about hydrogen. And that is important that the government gives more emphasis on these technologies, but then also supports business either to subsidize this technology to allow fleets to decarbonize, or even just create that attitude for the government for businesses to want to invest in aspects like that. But on top of that, we also need to talk about the packaging and try and really embrace the circular economy. I mean, the government talks about the circular economy. Everyone likes it. It seemed to be the buzzword last year, the circular economy. But let's be honest, nothing much has changed when it comes to that aspect of it. And that is something the government really needs to emphasize and work with businesses, because when it comes to packaging and circular economy, only by the government working with the businesses can we actually make that change happen. But I just want to touch on one other aspect about the economy. The economy is going down the tube rapidly. The governments across the world are providing bailouts to businesses, supporting businesses, which is great. What I'd like to see is more what they've done in France, where they are tying often some of these deals and these bailouts and packages and grants to the environmental standards of companies. And at the moment, there aren't any, they're giving bailouts and grants to companies to support them, which is right, but there's no link to anything like environmental issue or decarbonisation. As a government, we need to lead by example and say, yes, we will look after your company, we'll save your company, but you also need to make that fundamental shift. You need to invest some of this into decarbonising and better the environment. And that is how I can see is how the government can work with business to support business, but also help businesses change their very models.
Thanks. The headline figure attached to the UK government's Green Recovery Plan, correct me if I'm wrong, is 350 million. You said that sort of beyond that, there is no money, which is sort of an ominous echo of that post-it note left in 2010 for the incoming Chancellor, I think. Is it remotely, does it match the scale of the challenge, the amount of money that has been earmarked for the kinds of business incentivization that you talk about? And do you genuinely think that the government, the UK government with all its other preoccupations right now, can do a good job of fine-tuning those incentives and avoiding the trap of trying to pick winners and then picking the wrong ones?
Yeah, well, I think the 350 million is a great start. Let's be honest, it is a lot of money, especially in this climate. But to me, it's, as Claire mentioned, it's not about the government telling businesses what to do and using this whole pot of money to sort of shift paradigm. To me, that 350 million is meant to be used, almost to sort of seed the ideas, the business, and help the businesses move forward. Now, we haven't really seen huge steps over the crisis of businesses, especially looking from the government perspective, of actually making that shift to go green. I think quite a lot of businesses, understandably, have tightened their belts, have really cut down what they are doing. Their words are talking about it, but they're not nearly as many promises coming through as had been before. So the problem we've got, as the government's got, is to try and actually get businesses back to think about improving what they're doing. I know some companies clearly are doing some great works, but a lot of them really aren't thinking about that. And that 350 million was perfect for a time when, frankly, a lot of businesses and companies were moving in that direction. But now times are getting a lot harder. A lot of those businesses seem to not be as forthcoming with their ideas. So the question is, do we need to increase that level of money? Ideally, yes, but with the way things are, it's going to be tougher. Or are we more likely to say, go back to businesses, if we're giving you our support, what are you going to do about it? You can't continue as business as usual, and therefore really need to push that forward. And that, I think, is vital when it comes to doing it. The government made great plans about legislating for 2050. It's basically set the parameters, and until very recently, business has been moving in that direction. I think the fear at the moment is due to the ongoing recession that they're going to sort of scale back for that. So the government, I think, needs to be a bit more proactive by actually saying, right, we saved your businesses, we say what's going on, you need to now step up to the plate. This is not business as usual. You need to actually say, this is what we're doing and how quickly you're going to do it.
Right, thank you. Which raises the interesting point about where responsibility, the balance of responsibility between business and government on this. In a second, I'd love to come to B. Boylo, who has mentioned in the chat the question of a more centralized form of ESG ratings, which may or may not, I'd love you to explain in a second after we go to Claire, whether what you're asking for is basically to solve the measurement problem that Claire was talking about. But Claire, you've also just mentioned in the chat your pride in the fact that you were involved in the UK becoming the first government to commit legally to net zero by 2050. That's a great line in the sand. But given that we're discussing whether companies can cut the cord with whether you want to say business as usual, or plastics, or fossil fuels, is there a risk that the legal burden here is on government and not business, and that therefore businesses in this country, at any rate, perhaps unlike Aichi, are going to sit around waiting for the tablets to come down from on high?
Well, thank you. And great chat, by the way. I'm really enjoying typing away frantically. And I have no particular reason to come to the government's defence, but I do want to sort of support some of the stuff Alex is saying. So to actually pass that legislation, and we were the first industrialised country to do so, followed, it has to be said, 24 hours later by France, but we still got there first. We also have a committee on climate change, which was set up by Ed Miliband, which is an amazing asset because we actually have a governance structure, unlike almost any other country in the world, that actually the government does listen to. And we have carbon budgets, and I've been the hapless minister that has to get up and defend, why we are 5% off a budget that ends in 10 years' time, but still have to defend it in Parliament. So I think we have a very strong governance and transparency structure that very few governments do, and by the way, very few companies do yet. And to Alex's point about, is the green recovery money enough? Possibly not, but there are some really big structural changes going on in the economy. So we talk about hydrogen, we talk about decarbonising heavy industry. Everyone talks about the first 20%, we should all stop flying. Actually, nobody ever talks about what's the plan for steel. We have no plan for steel. And unless we get steel emissions to near zero in absolute or net terms, we're not going to hit anything like the Paris targets. Part of the plan for steel is carbon capture and storage in industrial clusters. We are doing that right now in Teesside and other areas with quite substantial money that the government had previously invested. So you have to have a whole of economy approach. It has to be, in a way, business as usual, not just COVID response to deliver. And I guess to your point about companies not having the same level of legal obligation, really interesting. Some companies, and EDF is one, are now putting this net zero obligation in their statute. So they're legalizing their fiduciary duty to deliver to shareholders. And the other thing companies are doing, and no politician is ever paid on this basis, is starting to pay management and staff partly whether they hit their ESG targets. And ESG targets, as we've had in the chat, are there's a question about what they actually mean. But if you're now getting caught at 25 or 50% of your compensation based on what you think the ESG target is, and that's very transparent, that starts to be a real powerful driver. So this question about governance, transparency, and incentives is so important. I did an MBA 30 years ago, and I learned the number one thing was maximizing cash flow on shareholder capital. That's it. Now we need to start having the conversation at business schools and in boardrooms about, no, it's not that. It's about maximizing this stakeholder value and being very transparent and clear about the measurement is. And it can all sound a bit pious, but it's actually happening. So some of the world's biggest companies, Unilever to pick one, I know you've had Alan on, are actually doing this. And I genuinely think it's not, it's not greenwash.
Great. Well, that's good to hear. And I'm sure he'll be glad to hear that too, as will all of Unilever's customers. I want to come back to Josh shortly before we run out of time, but I did mention B's point, and thanks for the segue, Claire, by mentioning ESGs. B, if we can come to you, what's your point about ESGs?
A couple of points. Firstly, that currently it's such a broad area that if you look at different firms' ESG ratings, they tend not to correlate with one another, which points to a kind of broader question of what metrics are chosen. There's, I think, the open question of which metrics are you choosing? Is it possible for especially larger firms to essentially greenwash by choosing metrics on which they score well? Quite often, if you look at firms' ratings, they'll look at companies' models, but not what they're actually selling, which leads to the situation where you get kind of tobacco oil firms rating very highly on ESG measures because only their models, not their products, are being considered. I think also the biggest problem is really data transparency. I think currently, if you look at quite a lot of indices of top companies, only about half of them will release data on actually how much carbon emissions they're releasing, for example. If you don't have that data, it's quite difficult how you can see how you put together an actually comprehensive measure of ESG, especially in the case where, say, larger companies are better able to afford to invest in disclosure. And so you'll get a situation where ESG measures are just correlated with the size of a firm rather than anything actually meaningful about their environmental impact.
So what would be your solution? Are you advocating some kind of a, well, as you say, a more centralized form of ESG ratings? Who would hold the ring there?
I'm not sure. I think what you need is more centralization on what measures you're choosing. That needs to be standardized across firms, or the measure just ceases to have any meaning. And then you've got to have investment in data transparency and ensure that companies are able to afford to and are releasing data on the metrics that you have then chosen. Otherwise, the ratings become relatively meaningless.
Right. Well, I hope that in a small way, the Tortoise Responsibility 100 Index can nudge people in the right direction, and B, compare apples with apples. Really interesting point. Josh, if I can come back to you, I'm really interested to know how this conversation sounds to you in the States. We're worrying ourselves silly about the relationship between government and business. You've done everything that you've done without the slightest nudge from government. Indeed, during a period when the US federal government, at any rate, you made the point that state governments often act independently, thank goodness, has been, engaged in outright climate denial. Do you think that we need over here in Europe to pull our heads out of the sand and accept, as Claire put it, that business in a sense has to lead and not wait to be led by government? But on the flip side, I'm really interested to know, how do you think post-November 3rd, if there is a change of administration, the regulatory environment might change for businesses like yours?
There's a lot in there. So first, I would say that I think all of us are, in many parts of the world, increasingly losing faith that government is able to act in a decisive and urgent way to solve our needs. And so if business can't step in, who else is there that's organized in a way to have an impact at scale, right? Those are kind of your two choices. I do think there's a narrative out there that you either have to be a good business or a good citizen. And I think that's largely a false narrative. I think that in being a good citizen makes you a better business and vice versa. I would love to see more standardization around ESG metrics. I think that would be incredibly helpful if we all had the same scorecard and the same accounting treatment. Just like in the United States, we have FASB, which determines the rules of the road for accounting. Something similar to that for ESG, I think would be very helpful. And I know I would welcome that. And I think many of my colleagues would welcome that. I do want to say that if you're thinking about stakeholder value versus shareholder value, I think the longer your time horizon is, the more those two converge. In other words, if you're thinking about the business as an owner and you're thinking about owning the business over a long period of time, looking after stakeholders is good for shareholders. And there's two constituencies in particular I would point to: consumers and employees. I think consumers care. I think the reputational risk of being a bad citizen, the reputational risk of polluting the environment, of not having fair pay practices, of all of those things is extremely high. And over time, brands cannot survive not being good citizens, I believe. Second, more and more we work in a knowledge economy. I know for Etsy, it's all about attracting the best talent and retaining the best talent. And our team looks to me and looks to the company and says, what kind of values do you have? How do you lead? And they make, that is a very important factor for them in terms of whether they want to work for Etsy or not. And our role in, for example, trying to be a sustainable company in the environment has been incredibly important in the minds of my employees. And so if nothing else, if you just want to be a shared capitalist, it's been a great investment in order to attract and retain the best talent, and that's good for shareholders. So I think there's often a false narrative out there about the trade-offs between the two. I do think that it's really incumbent upon corporate leaders right now to step up, because we as a society are so divided in so many different countries that there's just a ton of gridlock in government. Right.
And speaking of which, I'm going to drag you into a brief political side chat here. What is your expectation and your hope for the political environment in the US post November 3rd?
Well, I think the point of this talk is about climate change. And, I certainly believe that the climate is changing, and I believe that human intervention is a leading cause of that change. And I think that change is already having devastating impact on the lives of millions of people around the world. And I think that we need to act with urgency. And I certainly hope and will lobby that the United States becomes much more active in leading the world in actions and conversations around how to take that kind of urgent action to reduce our carbon footprint. And we have to do it globally. This is not, carbon doesn't know state borders. But the United States had historically been a leader in conversations like this. And I think it's a terrible shame if we are no longer positioned to do that.
What's your sense of the appetite for the rest of corporate America to take a lead in the way your company has? We heard earlier today, I mean, many people know about this from the previous famous climate litigation cases, that Exxon accurately predicted the number of parts per million CO2 in 1980, and yet remains an unapologetically oil and gas business with no plans to shift wholesale into renewables. Some people would call that honesty. Some people would call that a failure of leadership. Left to their own devices, what do these, what sort of direction do you think those big names in corporate America are going to head in?
Obviously CEOs are not a monolithic, all like-minded group, but I can say I spend a lot of time talking with my peers running other big companies, and the vast majority of them, I believe that climate change is an urgent threat to the world, believe that human intervention is a leading cause of that. They believe in the science. And I think that they are parents. I think that they are, spouses. I think they are members of their community, and they want to be good citizens. And I think giving them paths for action that are practical and immediate is important. I know for me, the first thing that I looked at Etsy is sustainable, renewable energy for our offices, which is great, but I knew that was a pretty small part of our actual carbon footprint. And I hadn't been tracking the offset market, and I'd heard a lot of skepticism about it and a lot of reason for concern. And frankly, I hadn't paid attention to offsets in like 20 years because of that. And when my team brought me some very credible investments we could make that truly would pull carbon out of the air, it was surprising to me. And how cost effective that was surprising to me. So we actually bought 1 day of carbon neutrality for every company in America just to make a stand. We offset all of the shipping for all e-commerce companies in America for a day. And the idea was if little old Etsy can afford this, then you could too. And the reason that we did that is I'm pretty convinced that my peers just don't even know that it's an option. And I'm not trying to say that offsets are the end all be all. I'm not trying to say that they're the savior of humanity, but it's a whole lot better than nothing. And giving people options for what they can do now, how they can take action. I think that there's just some level of education that I think is important, because the vast majority of corporate leaders, they go home and they look in the mirror and they say, was I a good person today? Just like everyone does, right? They want to believe that they're making a positive impact. So I'm optimistic that we're going to find paths for action and be able to make change.
That's good to hear. Before we run out of time, I want to come first back to Alexander and then finally to Claire. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to call on more people in the chat, but that is partly a function of 45 minutes. I do want to draw attention to a question. It's a political question that Rob Beck asks in the chat. Claire, what do you think convinced the government, the UK government, to set the 2050 target? The school strikes, Extinction Rebellion, Blue Planet, or something else? I've come to you with that and one other question in a second. But first, Alexander, Josh just said that if you give yourself a long enough time frame, he reckons that the interests of shareholders and stakeholders tend to converge. From your perch, formerly in business, now in politics, dealing with UK businesses, do a critical mass feel that way too? And are they taking the long view despite the crisis that we find ourselves in? Or, being brutally candid, is next year going to be a fight for survival?
I think you're right, your first point, Charles. I think they do converge. I do think it's incredibly important. The public and business mind is changing rapidly. Even like organizations like Shell, which I worked for, they know that the future wasn't about high carbon, it was about low carbon. It was about trying to move the business models into there, and it was trying to actually make the renewable sector, the low carbon sector, more profitable. And that is very important. So I think they know business cannot go on as usual, not in the medium term. Maybe the next 10 years, yes, but after that, business would just collapse if we don't take into account what the consumers want. And the government needs to be ahead of that curve and to help push businesses to speed up that process.
Thanks so much. Claire,
yes.
Are we being all Pollyanna-ish about this? I mean, it's all very well to point up the sort of common interests between shareholders and stakeholders, the changing mood of the moment. But I'm really struck, for example, by the fact that once BP put some flesh on the bones of its net zero plans, its share price tanked. Let's come back to the original question. In your view, can UK companies, the 200 plus that you're dealing with now, cut the cord with business as usual, or is the current crisis going to prove a rather rude reality check?
So I think it's a mixed bag. So look, the point of this is that the science doesn't go away. So we can either act now and act collectively and work out public-private ways to get together and just to show a high point. So people may have seen the government's got a new commitment to offshore wind, saying we can have up to 50 gigawatts, and that's wonderful. 2 years ago it was 10 gigawatts. We reckon we could do 700 gigawatts, just out of the North Sea. We have this extraordinary opportunity to get offshore wind powering much of Northern Europe very, very cheaply. And that was a function of really actually very good financial engineering around the contract structure, really impressive commitments by companies and the government working together. So we can have these individual breakthroughs. But Giles, you set it up very well at the beginning. So we've had 4 trillion of subsidy for renewable energy, and it is now 1/30th currently of total energy supply. So this business as usual idea is a false sense of security. And ultimately we want a safe landing zone, whether it's 1.5 or 2 degrees. We know what we need to do in terms of mitigating, reducing carbon. And to Josh's very good point, and I'd love to come back and talk about offsets, we need to pull some stuff out from a net basis. And there's an awful lot of theology out there about what you can and can't do. And my bias is always, well, we just need to do everything. It's not either or, it's both and it's now. So I think there is a wake-up call, but there was a very good question, which I tried to answer in the chat, about what persuaded the UK government to set the net zero targets. I mean, some of it was clearly the zeitgeist. So with Blue Planet. You know, only a few months ago, we were all walking around with our reusable coffee cups until they got banned. We've got our water bottles. You know, we really started to change our behaviour around plastics usage. The same with food. I mean, veganism has become the fastest growing food category in the UK, and clearly some of that there is an environmental sensitivity, I think, for a lot of that. But actually, the prosaic stuff was that the Prime Minister at the time just thought it was really important. And actually, the real trigger was the Commonwealth Summit, where the hard facts of climate change and what that is doing to the future livelihoods of millions of young people in some of the most vulnerable parts of the world was really stark. And as I said, we've got a really good committee of experts who can give us advice. So it's not just a load of, you know, smoke and mirrors. It's actually saying, can we technically and at the right cost achieve this trajectory? And we think we can. But, you know, if I can leave our group today with one thing, have a look at the Keeling curve every day on Twitter. Just pull it up and see every day, which is the Keeling curve is a 50-year measurement of CO2 in the atmosphere, parts per million, off the top of a Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. And it is the most terrifying curve, A, because it shows that we are outside all of our known boundaries, and B, the thing goes up by 2, 3, 4 parts per million a year, every single year. And COVID, frankly, is going to be a drop in the ocean. So we do have to cut the cord. We have to work together. We have to basically have as much transparency and exposure as the great work you're doing. But we are going to have to act on this sooner rather than later. And I would rather act on it sooner, because I think there are really interesting opportunities. And when you panic, as we're doing with COVID, we tend to miss those opportunities and do the wrong thing.
Great. Thank you, Claire, Alexander, Josh, everyone else who's pitched in the chat. Let's hope that a combination of the zeitgeist and cold hard facts, not just about what climate change will bring, but also what the opportunities that it might bring for business, will push everyone in the right direction. Just on that Keeling curve, the way I manage to go to sleep at night is to remember that if you zoom in on it, it's a sawtooth line.
Yeah.
Every spring, as the Northern Hemisphere's forests come into leaf, the atmospheric concentration of carbon goes down. And I happen to know somebody who lives in my part of London, used to work for Microsoft, now is possibly going to work for BP, who's working very hard along with other people on artificial photosynthesis. So I shouldn't be delusional about the power of tech to solve our problems. But let's hope, as you say, that we can mobilize everything, tech and financial engineering and good sense towards getting out of this in one piece. I see there are 82 messages that I haven't read in the chat. Thank you so much all for pitching in, especially to you, Josh, Alexander, and Claire, for joining us. And we now have 8 minutes until the final session, which will be a wrap up when you are all invited to tell us what we need to take away from all the sessions that we've had today, and report on research further at Tortoise. So see you after a cup of tea, or with a cup of tea. Thanks very much.